Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
There has been much upheaval in the National Park Service this year, with firings, then rehirings, and staff deciding to retire now then risk sticking around and being fired. There have been fears that more Park Service personnel are about to be let go through a reduction in force. While Interior Secretary Doug Burgum has ordered the Park Service to ensure that parks are properly staffed to support the operating hours and needs of each park unit, that message said nothing about protecting park resources. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. Among all this upheaval, the question that goes begging is whether the Interior Department is as concerned about protecting natural resources, including wildlife, as it is about seeing that visitors have a good national park experience. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Soukup, who during his National Park Service career served as the agency's chief scientist. When he joined the Park Service in 1975, Dr. Soukup, a distinguished coastal ecologist, biologist, and researcher, brought a clear vision for natural resource stewardship that would be embraced throughout the National Park Service and supported by visitors and local citizens. He was directly responsible for launching the Natural Resource Challenge, a $100 million funding initiative that brought the protection of natural resources of the parks to the forefront. We'll be back in a minute with Dr. Soukup to discuss the latest transformation of the National Park Service.
The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome to the Traveler, Mike.
Thank you.
So it was kind of a gloomy introduction I had there. What are you hearing from your contacts inside the Park Service about what is transpiring?
Well, a tremendous amount of concern, and I think it's rightfully so. I think we're losing an awful lot of fabric that was so hard to put together and is so important to the long-term health of parks. When people bail with institutional knowledge and experience, and that stands in danger of not being replaced, I think that's an incredibly dangerous time for national parks. National parks are not just the operations of the daily visitor experience, but it's the quality of that experience over generations that is really the essence of the mission. So I'm really concerned about losing some of the things that might not seem important to people coming from the outside, but the Park Service has learned over the years that a real science basis for management decisions is very important, and we're going to lose a lot of that if things keep going the way they're going.
Yeah, it's interesting, and of course, you and I are dug pretty deep in National Park Service machinations and lore and whatnot, and the general public, the 331 million folks who visited the national parks last year in 2024, They were coming to enjoy the beautiful scenery, maybe hike a trail, paddle a lake, perhaps spot a grizzly bear or a wolf. And they may not fully understand all that goes on behind the scenes in terms of what is the Park Service's primary mandate, which is to protect the natural resources for future generations unimpaired. It's a heavy lift for the Park Service that is done largely behind the scenes. I mean, you've got the Natural Resource Stewardship and Science program, and what we're hearing is that a lot of the senior managers there were either forced out or decided to retire rather than stick around. I mean, is that the case?
That's what I'm hearing. In fact, I think that's actually right on the money, because I've gotten letters and things like that of people really upset about leaving, but nonetheless they're leaving. And I think that's anytime that's done without any rhyme or reason or thoughtful process, a blanket exit is not a good thing. You really want to have in place people who understand the resources. And when they walk out the door, you can't replace that without decades of experience in some cases. So we're losing a lot of institutional knowledge. We're losing the things that make that park experience vital and vibrant over time. You don't want a lot of parks that lose their biodiversity. The freshness of seeing different animals and plants and migratory birds and all of that it doesn't happen without an awful lot of husbandry. It might look easy and it might look static and all of that, but it's changing all the time. And so much of that change is human induced if we're not careful. So it's really an intellectual exercise. The mission to me is of an incredibly complicated intellectual exercise. And it doesn't happen by paving the roads and fixing the roof and cleaning the restrooms. That's a great part of it. But the real part of it, I think, is why people come there. And that's for the resources and the full natural process of those resources is important to understand, so that you can make the right decisions and manage those parks for what you really want them to be over generations.
Do you know, like I mentioned, some of the senior leadership at the Natural Resource Stewardship and Science Division have left or are leaving. We've heard that a majority of regional Park Service directors are leaving. Do you know if these are folks who are being forced out or willingly retiring because they just are tired of doing the battle?
I don't know, and I know that two are staying, and I think that's great. I think the idea of being tired doing the battle or feeling devalued or feeling disrespected, in my mind, that's not a good reason to leave. That's happened before with Jimmy Carter and his zero-based budgeting. It's happened under Clinton and Gore with their reinventing government, where they gave people $25,000 if they'd leave, and whole offices left these big vacuums. It was just crazy. So it does happen, and it's so hard to do thoughtfully. If you see a need to attack the federal deficit, there's not many good ways to do it. There's not much discretionary spending there, and to do it at a flyover level, at a spreadsheet level, and not know what people do and how well they do it and how important it is to keep them doing it. If you don't know those kinds of things, it's really a process that's hard to justify.
Yeah, one thing we heard the other day, which we haven't been able to confirm, is that the U.S. Geological Survey's ecosystems mission staff might be let go. Have you heard that?
No, I haven't heard much about the USGS. They do important things. There's a real sense of longevity there too. They're some of their programs are so fundamental. I'm sure some of them are not the favorites of certain elements in the political parties, because they are looking at these large processes, and the implications of those processes are affecting a lot of the the business interest and the vested interest. So I'm sure there's pressure on that ecosystem level kinds of stuff, but I haven't heard too much about it.
Being a journalist, I've done this for a long time, 40 plus years professionally, and I've never encountered such a hard time getting information from the National Park Service as I have during the Trump administration. I mean, the Biden administration was difficult too. Don't get me wrong. I'm not choosing parties here. I'm just stating facts. We send up our questions and we get pretty much pablum in response that says nothing. I'm curious. Back in March, you wrote Interior Secretary Burgum, and while you didn't specifically mention the turmoil that the Park Service has been facing, you did point out that protecting the full scope of our nation's natural heritage, which has shaped our nation's unique identity, should be a top national priority of each administration and both political parties. There are key ecological areas not yet included in the current array of national parks, and this administration could be decisive in seizing opportunities for their protection and recreational use. Did you ever get a response?
No, not yet.
Do you have any hopes that you might get one?
Not really, because as I understand it right now, the secretary's focus is really on energy development and really has his mind on other things. And I don't know if he's embraced the whole scope of what he's responsible for. But protection and development, I don't believe the Park Service is complete yet. It doesn't represent the entire spectrum of this great natural heritage that we have. And I think someone in the presidency or in the secretarial position ought to look at that and say, this is something I'm going to leave as a legacy. I think the legacy of protecting some of the most incredible features of our national heritage is something you just can't diminish in its greatness. And I think it's just so important to do that. And I would like to see somebody get to Mr. Trump and say, Teddy Roosevelt did an awful lot for national parks, more than you have, and maybe he'll take the bait and run with it. I don't know. We need somebody who will champion the full representation of our heritage in national parks, and it's not complete yet.
Yeah, no, and I'm not sure how much hope to place in this administration. I mean, there have been talk that he's going to reduce the size of some national monuments, possibly by 1 million acres or more. Obviously, they've cut back personnel in the Forest Service and the National Park Service and some of the other land management agencies. And just the other day, the Trump administration announced that it planned to open the Pacific Islands Heritage Marine National Monument, which spans some 400,000 square miles. He's going to open it to commercial fishing. It just, you wait for the next day to see what's going to happen.
Well, I'm very concerned about Anwar. I've looked at that over decades, and it's been right on the brink several times of being developed, and people have stepped back from that brink, and I think very wisely. I think developing that would be a last resort for this nation when we were really, really desperate. We're not, and we ought to protect that place, and we ought to protect the heritage that we want to leave for the next generation, our kids and grandkids. So I hope they get over that. In Washington, it's so much depends on who you talk to and who's talking to you. And I don't think there are people in this administration who are talking to the president about things that have to do with the next generation and the America's cultural and natural heritage. And I think that's a problem. And I'm hoping that people who care about that are figuring out ways to get to these people and try to get some sanity in terms of what they want to leave behind as their legacy.
Yeah. I think one of the problems, and this has been developing over more than a few years, is the divisiveness in the country. And part of that is accelerated by those people who have the soapbox refusing to talk to both sides. They talk to the side that wants to hear their message. And to that point, you wrote Secretary Burgum back in March. You haven't heard back. We've put up a request to have Secretary Burgum on our podcast to discuss what his plans are for the Interior Department and the Park Service. And so far, nothing, although I did see he was on a Wall Street Journal podcast the other day. So they're talking to the choir as opposed to trying to reach out across the aisle, so to speak. And that's unfortunate because only through constructive conversation, I think, can you come to understand another point of view. And I think that's what's necessary now is understanding different points of view as opposed to just preaching to people who want to hear your message. And I've been preaching too much. Mike, I'm curious. Back in 2021, you and Gary Mackless, a social scientist whose lifetime of research and teaching focused on national parks, wrote American Covenant, in which you shared your insights, critiques, and recommendations about what America's national parks are, should be, and might become. In that, you wrote that park policy and management needed to be guided by science, which you said the National Park Service throughout its history has been unable and even unwilling to do. Specifically, you and Gary said that you have seen that the current park system has grown without a consistent vision, plan, or systemic identification of sites necessary to become representative, resilient, and redundant. A representative system requires something of everything of value. Resilience requires adequate size of land parcels and their healthy condition, and redundancy requires that we preserve more than one example of each type of ecosystem. Maybe it's an easy question, a softball question, but are you still concerned that science is not a guiding force for the Park Service under the current administration, and that there is no desire to see the park system grow through a consistent vision or plan?
Well, I'm absolutely concerned, and I'm certain that we're going to lose the progress that we've made in embracing science as a foundation for management. We built up programs. The National Park Service understood at the turn of the century that it had to do something else to be what it already thought it was. It wasn't, in many ways, really on top of the resources, didn't understand the resources well enough to make decisions that would ensure its longevity. One of the things that I found in my career early on was a real reluctance to have scientists at the table because sometimes they got in the way of things that people wanted to do. But you can't operate like that over the long term and keep parks healthy. I remember before I went to Washington, seeing an article written by a young researcher that talked about the great national parks had lost a number of their mammal species. And that caused quite a stir back then. Were the parks being protected? Were they being managed for preservation? There was a lot of pressure on the Park Service. And the Park Service responded by, well, those studies are flawed. They're dependent on National Park Service data, which are neither complete nor reliable. That's a hell of a note in terms of what you're purporting to do. If you're purporting to protect national parks, how do you actually prove that? And how do you actually demonstrate that you are? And if there are indications that you're not, it's time to get with the program. So at the turn of the century, we did build up science. A lot of the regional directors and a lot of the park superintendents understood that they were losing ground in terms of managing for future generations. So they supported a fairly hefty increase in natural resource stewardship and science. And we brought in scientists, we brought in inventories for parks, understanding what's in parks. We brought in monitoring to understand how they're doing over time. Are we losing things? Are we gaining things that we don't want? We started a lot of invasive species restoration and getting rid of them and putting the systems back together. And a lot of reintroductions of species like the condor, like the peregrine falcon, like the black-footed ferret. Putting all this stuff back together again, and don't forget the wolves. Putting all this back together again and managing it with a sense of knowing what's going on has got to be what the Park Service does. So we made a lot of progress in a couple of decades around the turn of the millennium. And I really fear that what's going on in Washington right now may really set us back decades, if not back to ground zero for using science and developing long-term understandings of what's going on.
I was gonna ask you about that because 5 years ago, during the COVID pandemic, a lot of research was temporarily halted, as I understand it, and so there was a gap there. And now what we're seeing with personnel being fired in research positions and inventory and monitoring positions, I mean, that's got to be greatly concerning on what could be lost, whether it's short term for 6 months or whether it's for 4 years or more.
Well, it's very concerning because there's no guarantee that it will be rebuilt. There's no guarantee that there's going to be a circle back and saying this really works or this is really important. Who's doing that? Who's going to do that? And what's their level of understanding of what's at stake? So yes, I'm very concerned, and I think we are going to lose an awful lot of the long-term fabric that it takes to understand these complex systems. You can't start and stop a monitoring program. You lose data and you lose the definition of trends, and that's very important. And the long-term databases have to be maintained and they have to be accessed and updated, and that's not going to be done. And without those long-term databases, how do you know what's happening? You don't. So I think it's very important that this not be done in a chaotic fashion and not done without understanding what you're losing for what you're gaining.
I want to go back to American Covenant, the book you wrote with Gary Macklis. In it, you mentioned about the park system being incomplete, and that redundancy requires that we preserve more than one example of each type of ecosystem. I can recall there was a congressman from Utah who once upon a time said if you went to Great Basin National Park once, you didn't need to go back because you'd seen it all and it wasn't that great anyway. We've heard calls for a Great Plains National Park that goes back decades, I think to the 1930s. There was calls for doing that sort of thing. Why do we need to do something like that when, certainly Great Basin doesn't hold a monopoly on bristlecone pines or glacial cirques, and there are other parks that offer that, just like Wind Cave and Badlands National Park offer some remnants of the Great Plains as history knows them. Why is redundancy important in the park system?
Well, in some cases, it's there, as you point out, with habitats that occur in more than one park. In many cases, that's not true, and I think it's important to look at it with a real set of experts who could actually look at that and decide whether or not these systems are going to be stable over time, and if not, how do you make sure that you have more than one system that won't be affected in the same way. I think it's important to look at the system and test it. And we brought in some ecologists a while back, some really good, solid people whose lives have been dedicated to looking at the diversity of habitats and systems across the nation. And we need to get people around there and sort of make a serious plan for what needs to be done to ensure that the national park system persists and is representative.
That's the challenge. The other day, we reported on the Traveler that the Trump administration was moving to tweak the Endangered Species Act language to remove the word harm from the definition of taking, I believe. Is that a big deal?
I think any change is got to be really well thought out. I don't know how much thinking is going on in that area, and it's not something that should be changed lightly. Every word in some of these acts makes an awful lot of difference, and I think the protection of some of these species would be harmed if you start allowing any kind of new activities that might influence their survival.
Now, recently, you were drafting some of your thoughts about what's going on with the Park Service in a message I believe you wanted to share with those staffers in the Natural Resource and Stewardship and Science divisions. And you were thinking about, now is not the time to lose leadership and experience in water rights, in mining and minerals, in endangered species, air quality, natural sound, ocean health, and on and on and on. And your thinking is that, if leadership or specialist positions are vacant, they stand a higher chance of elimination. Do you think that your message can get across to those remaining in the Park Service?
I don't know. It's a little difficult being an outsider now. Once you're retired, you really don't know what's going on the ground there. But I can only judge from afar that some of these losses are going to be really, really, really harmful to the National Park Service and to national parks. And if there's any way people can stick around and try to resist that, go through the system, make their cases for what they do and how important it is. If they're not there to do that, it's not going to be done. It's certainly not going to be done by the people who are in charge of the reductions. So it's very important that the best case be made for the programs that are so important but subtle enough that they can be cut and not restored. It really does bother me, and rather than stay silent about it, I'm trying to advise from the back of the bus, really, or in retirement. You're really not in charge of anything, and that's hard. So I do hope people make a decision that's based on some things they're going to have to take into account that I don't know about. But when there's a chance that they can stick around and defend their programs, I would like to see them do it.
Yeah, and I think it has to be from the front of the bus, so to speak. The other day we ran an op-ed piece from two former Park Service managers, and one of the things that both of them stressed was the need to stand up and speak out, to push back against what is happening out there to the Park Service, to other land management agencies. And from a journalist standpoint, I'm hearing lots of people voice their concerns about we're losing rangers, the restrooms are going to be dirty, you're going to have a longer line to stand in to get into your favorite national park. But nobody seems to really have a resounding message on what can be done to push back and affect change. And when you hear a Republican Senator Murkowski from Alaska, say that we're all scared, that really is discouraging for those who hope that there can be a stop to this madness.
Well, I go back to the idea that nobody really wants, I think, to see the degradation of our national parks. I mean, our approval record is pretty high. I think the National Park Service is the top agency in public approval. People go to national parks, and it's an experience that they treasure. A lot of people want to see them all. It's not something that government shouldn't do, and it's not being done that badly. In fact, it's going to be done more badly if it's subject to such upheaval. I think it's important that people try, Murkowski and others, other senators and all that, who care about the parks in their states. I fully expected national parks to be looked at and tweaked, but I didn't expect this, wholesale chaos. And I don't think it's what the American public wants. And at some point, I think the administration will be forced to circle back and try to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, but it's going to be hard.
Well, I'm curious about that, because there are those out there who believe that the administration is trying to so reduce the ability of the Park Service to manage the parks that it'll be easy to convince Congress that we should just let private corporations come in and take over these places?
Well, that's crazy. I'm sorry. That won't work because, the national parks are for generation after generation. When I was in Washington, I got invited to a National Academy study of which was all about how do you design an effort that keeps going in perpetuity. And they were looking at some of these federal disaster areas, places that had been infected with cholera and things like that, and nuclear waste, and they had to cordon those areas off, and they had to develop an agency or an agency with a mission of protecting these areas from the public forever. And they wanted to know, how do you get people interested in the long-term generation after generation mission? And so they went to the Park Service because that's kind of what we are geared up to do. And when I was coming into the Park Service, I had a 6 weeks course in the lore and traditions and implications of the National Park Service mission. And I think that's what it takes to develop an agency that's capable of doing things in perpetuity. Well, corporations are not geared that way, and it'll be a tremendous mess if anyone tampers with the national park system as it's laid out.
I guess we'll see as the months go by. I'm curious. We're talking about the national parks, of course, but there's a piece of legislation working its way through Congress. I'd be curious to get your opinion on. I think it's called the Fix Our Forests Act, and some people are concerned about the amount of logging that it will allow. And of course, the administration has voiced its opinion that we need more logging in the United States. Many national parks are surrounded by national forests. I mean, Yellowstone, Sequoia, Kings Canyon, Yosemite, Glacier. Any idea what impacts might happen to the parks by going into these forests and doing more logging or fixing them, as the politicians would say?
Well, there are two things. One is the logging, of course, and the second is the idea of logging to make them more fireproof and to address some of the issues with fire. And I think science is not there for this idea of increased logging. I think the science indicates that natural systems are as resilient and as fireproof as they can be, and that you can't mess around with them too much. Of course, we've had this long-term suppression of fire, and we have to go back and fix that. That's Smokey the Bear didn't do us any favors. I think it's really important that national forest be managed in a way that makes them viable over generations as well. And when they're around national parks, when they're girdled by clear cutting and so forth around national parks, there's been a history of that out west, and it's really anathema to migratory species and animals that come and go and have to move around. Ecological corridors are going to be so important with climate change. It's really time, and I can't imagine this administration wouldn't want to start to orchestrate the federal agencies to work together and to supplement each other's missions rather than work at cross purposes. There's so much of that goes on between the agencies that's one way that you could really increase efficiency and cut down on government waste and abuse.
And of course, with climate change, managing forests is becoming even tougher because of the devastating wildfires that we've seen in recent years. What I'm hearing is that the forests are drier, and so they're going to burn hotter, and it's bigger fires that create their own weather that are more intense, more difficult to control. So just one challenge after another we're faced with these days.
Well, it varies by region too, and in some cases it's the opposite. So you really have to look at impacts of climate change at a very fine scale and manage accordingly.
So you retired, just the same. You're very concerned about what's going on, and you've got some great insights. What do you do to enjoy your retirement?
Well, we have a Canadian sailcraft sailboat, 36-footer, that we visit all of the islands that we can. There's a couple of hundred islands off of the coast here, the main coast, and we want to see them all. And that keeps us pretty busy. My wife is into music and a bunch of different things. So Maine is a great place to be, but don't tell anybody about it.
I'll keep it just between the two of us, Mike. That's Michael Soukup. He was the Park Service's chief scientist during his career with the agency. Mike, thanks so much for your time today. It's good to get your perspective on the state of the Park Service as well as the state of the national parks.
Well, I hope everybody in Washington weathers this storm and navigates in the best interest of not only themselves, but the national parks.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it informative. This truly is a time of transformation for the National Park Service. And if you're concerned about the national park system, it's definitely a time to stay informed, to understand all of the impacts, and to speak out if you disagree with them. Next week, our guest is scheduled to be U.S. Representative Jared Huffman, the ranking Democrat on the House Natural Resources Committee. I'm sure that will be an interesting conversation. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.